I recently wrote an article regarding the Colonial Pipeline because a lot of people don't realize the pipeline itself wasn't actually hit. It was the billing system that got hit. Most people don't understand that IT networks like that would run the computers for a billing system are different than OT networks or operational technology networks that actually run things like industrial control systems or ICS that run things like pipelines.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an IRONSCALES podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IRONSCALES, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Today I'm joined by Nick Espinosa, Chief Security Fanatic, CIO, speaker, columnist, author, radio host, board member, Ford's Tech Council, and TEDx speaker. For over 25 years, Nick has been on a first-name basis with computers. Since the age of 9, he's been building computers and programming in multiple languages, landing his first IT job at the age of 15. Nick founded Windy City Networks at 19, which was acquired in 2013 by BSS-I2. In 2015, Nick created Security Fanatics, a cybersecurity, cyber warfare outfit dedicated to designing custom cyber defense strategies for medium to enterprise corporations. Hey Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today on the 5 Laws of Cybersecurity from your framework. But before we begin, would you mind telling our listeners about you and your background and what you're working on these days?
Sure. I am the chief security fanatic, Security Fanatics. We do all things cybersecurity, cyber warfare, cyber terrorism, infrastructure, government compliance related. I also have a nationally syndicated radio show on NPR, like public radio station. I co-authored a book a while back. I've done 3 TED Talks and all that kind of stuff. And so I like to say it's not in my blood, it's in my DNA.
So I wanted to open up today's episode with a TED Talk and a Forbes article you wrote some time ago, and it's still highly relevant today. The presentation addressed issues that non-technical users face and how we as the technical community can help create an easy framework of understanding for those we help in order to ensure their security. And it goes on to say the 5 laws of cybersecurity are designed to make everyone think and challenge the technology they use every day. So would you like to add anything before unpacking for us the 5 laws?
Sure. I think one of the most important jobs that we have, whether we're in cybersecurity or IT or another form of technology, is basically what I like to call nerd to English translation, or nerd to whatever language you speak translation. One of the things that we have a very serious problem with in our group, whether it's IT, cybersecurity, technology, etc., is conveying those concepts that we have to that person. I'm not expecting, my elderly mother to understand what DNS is, right? But she can understand how to get to a website and how that basically resolves. And so by virtue of that, yeah, I think it's creating that understanding that gives people better ammunition, better reasoning to go ahead and say, yeah, I really do need, in my case, cybersecurity, in my life. And so by virtue of that, the 5 laws were designed to do exactly that. I figure, if my elderly mother could understand the 5 laws, anybody could understand the 5 laws because she's not that tech savvy, right? So that was essentially the premise for that, basically creating a common language for understanding cybersecurity for the world. And it's been talked about and ripped off and used by a lot of different organizations, including the Trinity Challenge, which is backed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as Facebook. And it's also been incorporated now into college curriculums and everything. So I'm pretty proud of that work that I've done there.
Yeah, I think there's a saying, imitation is the highest form of flattery.
Yeah, I was fine with it. I actually found out that a woman in South Africa actually claimed it as her own and went up on stage and said these were my 5 laws of cybersecurity and went right down my presentation, and it put a smile on my face. Like, hey, that's great. She's getting something out of it. It doesn't bother me at all. I just I found that amusing. I mean, it'd be nice to get credit, right? But if not, it's hey, people are learning and she's spreading the word on the other side of the planet from me. So more power to her. Right on.
For sure. So I would love to start with, the first law. And I think it goes, if there's a vulnerability, it will be exploited, no exceptions.
Yes. Yeah. If there's a vulnerability, it will be exploited, no exceptions. And if you think about it, that's the absolute truth of the situation. We love technology, we embrace technology, and oftentimes we don't necessarily know that the vulnerabilities exist, but if they do, they will be found. There's an army of people that want to hack into everything, whether they're criminals or good people or researchers or whatever it is. We even have standards for hacking non-technical things called life hacking, how we can organize our closet better, how we can do other things. We want to find ways around the rules, around the systems for absolutely everything. And that's what that law specifically speaks to. So I could be sitting here, ostensibly thinking that I'm in a network that's Fort Knox, but at some point there's going to be a vulnerability that crops in. And hopefully the makers of my technology will be updating it and continuing to look for that vulnerability. But if not, I very well may be exploited at some point because somebody will have innovated around those defenses. So we have to maintain that kind of vigilance.
You go on to say law number 2, everyone is vulnerable.
Yep. Everything is vulnerable in some way. And I think that's beyond important because even as I just mentioned, even if we don't know that the vulnerability is there is somebody that's going to find it. Now, if you think about the history of the internet, there was basically a criminal authentication systems of Google, Apple, Amazon, like you name it. It was unbelievable. Here in the nickname Cosmo the God. Now, he was a jerk and a criminal and stealing things, but it made everybody slam on their brakes and say, wait a second, how we're applying our multi-factor authentication clearly has flaws, clearly has vulnerabilities. And now we have to change that up. And the world thought, well, I've got MFA, I've got multi-factor authentication, I'm secure, and here we are. So we find these, we improve on these, and we keep on going. But everything is indeed vulnerable in some way. We just may not have discovered it yet.
And law number 3 actually made me laugh when I watched your presentation. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Humans trust even when they shouldn't.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And when I actually did the TED Talk, I was up on stage and I was wrapping up law number 2 for those that haven't seen it. And obviously, I recommend everybody does. But if you haven't, at the end of that, I actually say, now before I move on to to law number 3, I'd like you, the audience, to look under your seat for something that my team put there. And everybody in the audience, I could see it from stage, from far all the way to the back, where the cameras were. Everybody got up if they could and looked under their seats and all that for something that my team put there. And I didn't have a team there. It was just me. And basically there was nothing there. And that went to law number 3, which is humans trust even when they shouldn't. And it really underscored, I think, that we have those tendencies to trust, that we want to trust. But by virtue of that, when it comes to technology, that gets us into trouble. We fall for phishing scams. We make false assumptions that our computer is safe because we bought antivirus. It's oftentimes not. And so what we have to create is essentially a filter of distrust as we're approaching technology. Maybe that Wi-Fi in our local coffee shop isn't as secure as we think it is and could potentially steal, called Trust Sucks, which is actually diving more into the trust factor that we have. And that's a very serious issue. And so that had to be a law, because quite frankly, I think it's our greatest trust and it gets us into trouble. And our biggest vulnerability, if not the biggest vulnerability, and I'm sure it is the biggest vulnerability in cybersecurity, is humans. I told you a Ferrari defense, but if I'm turning the keys to the Ferrari chimpanzee, how far are we going to get, right? We need to learn how to drive. And that's essentially what I'm talking about with law number 3.
Just to quickly sidetrack from the 5 laws, and it's still going on right now. If you type in Venmo login into Google, I think the 3rd or 5th result is a fake login page. It's called sites.google.venmo login. It's one of the first times I've ever seen a fake login page on Google in the Google search results. Number 5 in the search results.
Right. Well, that means people are clicking on it. Google ranks it based on traffic and popularity, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff in their secret sauce. And so if you're seeing a phishing site, show up in the first 10 hits of Google, especially when you're talking about a site as big as Venmo, that's clearly a huge problem, that Venmo has that obviously they need to address if they don't know about it, or Google needs to look at and obviously kill. But yeah, it's these kinds of things that we think about. The infrastructure and technology around an entire generation of kids, that essentially were born with mobile phones in their hands for the most part. They assume technology is there for their convenience, there for their use. They don't understand that free wireless might get them in trouble, or that app might be stealing their data, or the person that's messaging them might not actually be a friend. It might be a predator of some kind. So it's a huge problem. And and as the world has come together and we have this amazing common language platform that is the internet, we really have to pound it into everybody. Everybody has to learn and understand that this is just a huge, huge problem that we have worldwide.
The next law segues quite perfectly. With innovation comes opportunity for exploitation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's something that we've seen over and over and over again. We can go back a couple of years and look at the explosion of IoT when IoT really first started booming, and the Mirai infection. Essentially people were thinking, oh, I'm just going to set up this IoT device and it's going to, do whatever it does for me. It's going to record shows, or, it's a toaster that's going to print things on bread that I can download, whatever it is. And we just assume that once it's up and running, it's safe. But most of these have basic passwords like password right out of the gate, and nobody changes them. Nobody thinks about this. And so the Mirai virus, the attackers went around and found every open DVR, every open wireless access point, every open router they could find, using the 50 most common passwords like admin, password, ABC123, like all that kind of stuff, and got in and was able to actually weaponize millions of IoT devices. And as we improve in our technology, like health technology, we have to understand that as we're improving on that, we also have that vulnerability. I mean, look at the pacemaker, for example. We found a massive vulnerability in pacemakers, a few years back, that literally if somebody was able to attack the Bluetooth in it, they could have made your heart explode. And how many times have we updated Bluetooth, since that came out? But we also have this standard as we are developing vehicles or things that are integrating products like Bluetooth, that we're not updating them in the way that we need to. And that's a very serious problem. Go look at any major car company, which is Tesla. They're the only ones that don't do this 100% of the time. And you buy that car in 2015 and you go in 2016 to get an oil change. Are there any updates to my head unit? Are there any updates in team? No. In 18. This is what we're talking about here. We're not really, keeping up with these things. And as we're creating these new and innovative products, there are people out there that say, oh, that's cool, that's new, I want to break that. And they will. And here we are. So it's a huge thing that we really need to make sure that when we are evolving our technology, we are marrying it with cybersecurity. It's beyond important.
One of my previous guests was talking about how this new building had just installed their HVAC system, and it was brand new out the box, and the operating system was end of life, and they had already bought it. So that's a perfect example of not marrying security with device.
Absolutely. And when you're looking at things that, like HVAC systems, it's a huge, huge problem, because everything's getting interconnected because it makes it easier to control and monitor the building. But if we don't have good patch management, if we're not updating these things on a regular and frequent basis, we're just getting ourselves into trouble. We can evolve the coolest technology and toys, but if we're not marrying it to cybersecurity, it's going to get hacked, it's going to get hit, and it's pretty much going to ruin your day or worse. So it's a problem. It really is.
And just to summarize the 5 laws, so number 5 says, if in doubt, refer to law number 1.
That's right. When in doubt, see law number 1. If there's a vulnerability, it will be exploited, no exceptions. And it's designed to be circular, but it really all does come back to that. Because we are looking at any kind of vulnerability that we can find, that we can discover, that we already know about, to basically use that. And I like to say, like when I'm on stage with audience, which I am quite a bit, you give me a firewall that's, 1 or 2 firmware versions back, and I can probably walk right through it. And it's not because I have to innovate and figure out the way to do that. It's because all of the exploits have, for the most part, been published in things like MITRE's CVE database. I got inserted into an exploit framework and hit you. And these are the things that a lot of companies really don't understand. So we have to understand that the hacker's mentality, which is the core point of law number 5, the hacker's mentality is what we are combating. And so we have to think like a hacker if we are going to stop the hacker, which means we have to be proactive in our defense. And it's just a beyond important law, I think, even though it, like I said, it closes the loop for all of them, because at the end of the day, that's the problem: vulnerability exploitation.
So, in your 20 plus years of experience, have the fundamentals of cyber breaches changed?
Oh God, am I that old? Yeah. Yes, it has. It's been 20 plus years in this, and yes, I can say I started my first company in '98, and when it came to cybersecurity, anything, I was the redheaded stepchild in the room. Nobody wanted to buy technology that was above and beyond just the simple stuff that got them from point A to point B. Nobody understood just how bad this would get. And yeah, I mean, we've seen tactics evolve and evolution evolve. When I broke into my first public system in the 1990s, it was a much different animal than it is, doing that now. In terms of defenses, awareness, and capability, we've seen an evolution in attacks and types of attacks. Ransomware alone, just whatever evil genius thought that up, I mean, it's brilliant, but I want to punch him. I mean, it's, that alone changed the landscape, because, that evolved not just to a single platform of extortion, but now we're seeing double extortion and even triple extortion stem out of ransomware, and it's become a huge, huge problem. It's to the point where there are actual debates within the cybersecurity community if here in the United States we should actually be declaring a national emergency based on ransomware. So yeah, it is vastly evolved in the last 20 years, and it will continue to. I don't know what the next iteration of it is going to be, but I just know that unlike most technologies, cybersecurity is one of those fields that we have to slam on the brakes and pivot when that 15-year-old kid decides to break Google and nobody saw it coming, and now we have to say, what just happened? How do we defend this? How do we contain this? And now we have to pivot and make sure we're applying that to any platform we're using in a similar manner. And so it's a huge, huge problem that we have. Those things are not going away, but, just this latest case of triple extortion, with locking out the files, extorting the company that got hit, and then sifting through the files to say, hey, wait a second, we have Apple's design schematics, because it was that Taiwanese company. God, now we're going to go extort Apple, because Apple usually has more cash on hand than the U.S. government. So, they're going to get nailed too. And these are things that we really have to worry about. And the cybersecurity community itself has been focused very heavily on identity management, because we have so many stolen usernames and passwords out there. But we're also really looking at supply chain assurance, because it's not just us defending our own house. If we're giving part of our data out to another house somewhere, we have to get assurances that that house is defended in a way to keep our data safe as well. And that's something that I think a lot of companies are really starting to come into focus to, as they realize, oh my God, half the breaches we're seeing at least are third parties that are getting us hit. And that's obviously a huge problem we've got right now.
Despite from what we see in the news day in and day out, are we as a collective getting any better or worse at addressing the fundamentals of security?
So I don't think that's an interesting question. And I will say simply this. I think that we are more aware of this situation. I think that a lot of people look at the news and every week they see some kind of data breach, and we've had some pretty spectacular ones in 2021 so far, or late to 2020 to now. And people, I think, see that and say, oh God, like I need to do something, but I'm not necessarily sure what I have to do or what I can do. I'm not necessarily sure who I should call, but I know this is a very important issue. Then we have another segment of the population that basically has fatigue. And what I mean by that, and we see this constantly, is like, well, I got hit again. My data's out there. Marriott got hit. Equifax got hit. Whoever got hit, and I'm just resigned to that fate. Not really understanding that data and information ages. And so while some things are fixed here in the United States, like your social security number, where you live, what your passwords are, all of these things essentially evolve and change over time. And so the more defense you have now, the further away you are from that past data breach. And basically here we are. The caveat to that is, you go use an airline. Well, all the 90% of the major airlines just got hit, if you didn't know that, and so now we are trusting in a way when we are walking into, let's say, a local store and we're handing our credit card out, we're trusting them to handle that properly. or a hotel chain or even the credit scoring companies or airlines or whatever that is. And so that is something that I think really needs to shift in public perception. Are we doing better? Yeah, we're making more innovative products. The problem is a lot of companies are very slow to change and have complacency, meaning their own internal IT staff, which typically aren't cybersecurity trained, are saying, well, we've been using X firewall, it's no problem. Well, that firewall may have been basically outclassed by several of its other competitors that are better at threat detection, and here we are not keeping up. So while a lot of this new really cool stuff is out there, and some of the more advanced companies are seeing this because they've got good chief information security officers that are saying, oh yeah, we need to pivot, this is going to be huge, many out there aren't, or they simply don't have the budget. That's why small to mid-sized businesses are such a huge target for ransomware, because they just don't invest in that. And even though it's they're not going to pay out nearly as much as a large company, if I can hit 10 of them, I can make a hell of a lot more than just hitting one. So here we are, and I think it's a huge problem that we have.
What will it take to make bigger strides forward?
So honestly, sometimes things have to be forced. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the new cybersecurity model certification from the Department of Defense here in the United States, or the CMMC, that is one of those things where the Department of Defense went to the entire defense industrial base, which is 300,000 companies, and said, yeah, if you still want to work and you still want to make money working with the DoD, you've got to get this certification. And if you don't, by law, you're done. We're not going to work with you anymore. I have never seen something like that, where there's a zero tolerance, for cyber hygiene, in a major industry. And other major sectors of the U.S. government are starting to adopt this. NASA, DHS, looks like Treasury will do that. And so what we're seeing is essentially a compliance requirement that is very stringent, that is going to be pushed out. Recently President Biden was met with President Putin in Geneva, Switzerland, like a week or so ago, as we're sitting here talking, and they were talking about this kind of stuff. And President Biden mentioned the 16 critical infrastructure sectors of the United States. Well, all of that's going to start adopting these kinds of standards, which I think will essentially up the game, because it's like 85% of the economy or something like that. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. That doesn't necessarily help the residential, but what we may see is an order or a requirement coming out that the internet service providers of the world, Comcast, Verizon, etc., actually may have to start picking this up and doing some of this, not to impede you on where you want to go on the internet, but simply if you're going to a known phishing site, maybe Verizon's blocking your phone from going there, or Comcast is blocking your internet connection from going there, or AT&T, or whoever, and that's something that would help those people that simply just don't know or don't understand that a fake Venmo site looks just like the irregular Venmo site, and here we are, and it's one of the first hits on Google, and if you're not paying attention, you're going to the wrong place. So I think it's a huge thing.
Other than what we've just mentioned, what can you recommend that hasn't, already been said 1,000 times?
That hasn't already been said 1,000 times already. I mean, so the table stakes are, get encryption in your life. So if your device is lost or stolen, that's good. Get good antivirus and threat detection as best you can. Antivirus isn't perfect, but you've got to have something. Make sure you're getting a good web filter, because basically that will prevent you from going to a phishing site. And if you can't go to the site, you can't get infected or give away your information. Make sure you have things like good firewalls as well. But most importantly, the very first thing you should do, and it's free to any user, outside of corporations who need identity management solutions, go enable multi-factor authentication with an authenticator app on absolutely everything. I don't care if it's Facebook or your bank. Everything needs it. I think those things are beyond important. But first and foremost, outside of that, just stop and think. When you're walking into that coffee shop, do you really need to get on their wireless to check your email or look at Facebook or even stream Netflix at this point with 4G and 5G out there? And most of us are in areas where we get fantastic connections because there's a vast amount of infrastructure out there. You're infinitely more safe keeping into your own ecosystems. And also just keep a keen eye. If a deal looks too good to be true, don't click on the link. If your bank says you need to reset your password, go to your bank's website. I mean, these are very basic things, but at the end of the day, we as humans need to stop and we need to create a filter of distrust online for anybody we interact with, anybody that sends us something, and anywhere we're going to go. My mother can send me pictures, and oh, look at this, I just met with, scan all pictures. I don't know anything. She can send me a document expecting it, documents from client. I need you to review this PDF and then sign just to make sure that my client didn't accidentally get infected. We need to have that filter of distrust. And it's not that I don't like any of my clients, it's that I just don't know if they're going to get hit or not. And by virtue of that, I would hope they would do the same when I send them something. Odds are they're not, but that's one of the things I'm talking about here. So I think it's an important thing.
CyberSecurity Heroes is brought to you by IRONSCALES, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
Yeah, it reminds me of the zero trust model. Always verify, never trust. If you could just remember that, I'm sure we would all be 60-70% better than what we are now.
Most definitely. I mean, the old trust but verify model in technology, and I hear it a lot, when I'm on stage and somebody say, oh yeah, trust but verify, and I say, no, that's backwards. Because if I trust and then verify you, I'm automatically giving you a foothold into my technology, into my network, into my life, whatever that is. I am first going to verify, then I'm going to trust. And I think that's a really important message to have, in that sense. So by virtue of that, verification comes first. That means that is a human filter that you are walking into when every time you have a choice to connect to the Wi-Fi or not, or whatever you're doing, or click on the link or not. We have to have that in our minds. The technology around us, the filters, the firewalls, all that kind of stuff is backup to the human brain. It's when you make a mistake and click something or open something you shouldn't, that's when the technology kicks in to prevent it. And hopefully you've got good threat detection that will actually back you up in a decent manner.
And now that we've set the stage, I know you do a weekly episode of the latest breaches. You talked about the recent Colonial Pipeline findings, and it wasn't the headlines that we saw. I would love to, dive into that and maybe explain to the viewers how you got the intel, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. So one of my publishers, I also write for Michael Smerconish. He has a show on CNN. He also has a show on SiriusXM. I write for him as well. And I recently wrote an article regarding the Colonial Pipeline because a lot of people don't realize the pipeline itself wasn't actually hit. It was the billing system that got hit. Most people don't understand that IT networks that would run the computers for a billing system are different than OT networks, or operational technology networks, that actually run things like industrial control systems, or ICS, that run things like pipelines. The billing system was hit. Colonial realized that they essentially had 2 choices when their billing system went down. They could, 1, stop the gas and essentially figure out, undo the billing system to make sure that the billing's up and running, and then start the gas again. So stop the gas, or they could let the gas flow and then figure out the billing later with their insurance company, because they had insurance and all that kind of stuff. And they actually chose the national panic option, which was, we're going to stop the gas. Then the press gets wind of it and says, well, the gas isn't flowing. It's the largest pipeline in the United States. It's feeding 17 states. And what did we see? A complete freak out. Gas stations were overrun and went dry. People were fighting in line. People were hoarding gas. We all saw the pictures of people filling up everything that they could possibly get their hands on with gas because, again, people don't understand how this stuff works. And so that was a huge problem. And the first clues to that was actually Colonial's statements themselves about, their billing system went down and all of that. And, and then following up to ask, well, the operational technology network is different typically. And they were very careful with their words to say, yes, well, the billing system got hit. The pipeline was separate, and so they shut the pipeline down because they couldn't figure out who to bill what. And that obviously is a very huge problem. I don't mind if they thought some kind of threat was there and they shut down the pipeline to check to make sure that they didn't have an infection on that. That's a pretty easy vetting process, a pretty straightforward process for threat awareness. And once they had that figured out, they could have turned it back on and let that go. But yeah, the billing system got hit, not the pipeline itself. And I think that really also opens up another can of worms here in the sense that because it's considered critical infrastructure in the United States, they shouldn't have been allowed to shut the gas down once they verified that that network was operational and was free from infection in that way, shape, or form, because the billing is secondary to that point because they caused a national panic on the eastern seaboard. That's a huge problem. It's like 100 million people or so or more that were affected by this in the United States. So that was a huge, huge problem and just bewildering. But to your point, Brendan, everybody heard that the pipeline got shut down, and that's an issue. And I think the other thing that really underscores too is breach disclosure notification 100% for that. I think everybody because there was enough gas at every gas station to withstand the days that the pipeline that they had shut off the pipeline. And so if basically everybody in the United States didn't know that this had happened, we would not have seen riots. We would not have seen gas go dry because they would have been able to flow the pipelines before the gas stations ran out. So the media itself also helped to cause a panic by virtue of that. Everybody thought, oh my God, it's the end of the world. We're not going to get gas again, so let's all arm up and hoard. Here we are.
And even the ethics behind that decision is also just unacceptable. And what is even the legality of that? Is it legal to even do something like that?
So short answer is yes. So gas lines and pipelines are actually run by the FERC. That's their compliance, FERC, by the United States. It's not as aggressive as other utility platforms out there where there are requirements. What I think is going to happen is there's going to be a congressional investigation on this one. They're going to figure out, okay, what was the executive that pulled the trigger on that made that executive decision to say stop the gas because we can't bill? What could have been, obviously because they have insurance for this, they were covered for that. And so here we are causing a panic. So those are the kinds of things I think that we have to figure out with that. As far as the execution of that, the order to shut the pipeline off versus not when the pipeline wasn't hit, I'm not a lawyer and I don't work for I'm not a congressman, so I couldn't tell you the legality of that. I mean, to your point, the ethics side of that, the morality side of that dictates that it shouldn't. But like I said, because they're regulated under FERC, I don't believe that it was illegal for them to do that, but obviously I think that's going to be revisited.
And just for our viewers out there, where did you source your information?
Yeah, so in my article, I always link all my sources. I'm more than happy to share my sources. One is the actual Colonial Pipeline website and statement itself. And there's another cybersecurity researcher, I cannot remember her name for the life of me, that was actually doing a lot of investigative work on Colonial in a way that most people weren't. And it wrote, I believe it was on Substack, had written a complete breakdown of absolutely everything, to verify that. And Colonial essentially came out and said, yeah, that's what happened. We shut the pipeline down. So a lot of that reporting on that specific action was simply Colonial Pipeline's own words. They were very careful in crafting their statement, but if you go back and read that, their statement says the billing system was hit, the pipeline was not. It was just excellent investigative work by her, and I believe she's a cybersecurity reporter. I just cannot remember her normal publication. So, but it was great. It was fantastic, and I come with a lot of different sources. I never take one source at its word. I look at the various sources, and in this case, Colonial Pipeline being a source on their own hit, that's pretty solid evidence, of that. So there you go.
I'd love to dive into a few more examples.
Yeah, well, I mean, so SolarWinds was another huge one, and if you're a cybersecurity person watching this, you might have seen me at a conference talking about this. I recently did a conference talking about SolarWinds, excuse me. With that, obviously they got hit, but one of their infrastructure passwords was literally all lowercase SolarWinds 123. Those kinds of things where they were alerted to that in 2019, and obviously that allowed, I believe it was 4 different, basically 4 different groups to get into their network illegally. That's a huge problem as well. The quintessential supply chain data breaches that we've had recently that have been evolving over the last couple of months is one called SITA, or SITA as I'm calling it. Basically, this is a company that centralizes and runs all of the frequent flyer programs for the airlines. So over 90% of the major airlines in the world, American, United, Delta, Air India, Lufthansa, British Airways, on and on and on, all of them had to declare basically data breaches, because if you're a frequent flyer on anything, they now had your information on that. And recently, and airlines have been coming out for months per the compliance laws of their countries, but recently, I want to say in the last week or two, Air India came out and actually delivered a lot more details on essentially what their breach looked like compared to what the others were disclosing. And it seems like that's going to be a lot more severe than we realize. It's still evolving right now, even though that breach happened months ago. And another supply chain breach that's happening, or rather affecting a lot of cities around the United States, is Park Mobile. They got hit a couple of months ago, and by virtue of that, every city that you think of, and I believe even Spot Hero is backboned on them, but don't quote me on that. So when you went to park in your Park Austin, Texas, or Park Baltimore, Park Washington D.C., those are all cities that were using the Park Mobile platform, and so they got basically anybody that was using that app in their city data breached. And obviously that's a huge, huge thing. And so supply chains have been just a continuous problem. Obviously there's also JBS, the world's largest meat supplier. They went down, in Australia and the United States as well. That was a huge problem. And then, of course, there's also the FBI data breaching about 300 criminal organizations, which is a good data breach, when they were selling phones called Anon to all of these organizations, but they actually own the encryption keys to these so these criminal organizations weren't even using codes when they were using Anon phones to talk to each other. They're basically saying yes, move the 20 tons of drugs to this city, or yes, go kill that guy. And the FBI got all of it. And in conjunction with Australian law enforcement, Europol in Europe, and some other law enforcement, in the last few weeks, we've seen them kick in doors, arrest hundreds of people, seize tons and tons of drugs, weapons. They believe that they've stopped anywhere from something like, I think it's either 10 or 50 different assassinations in a single week of people that were supposed to be killed in order to do so over this network. So not all data breaches are bad, in that sense, which I think is a pretty good one to talk about.
And have you uncovered interesting findings when investigating these data breaches that, the headlines again were not conveying?
Yeah, I mean, and oftentimes what ends up happening is, and I do breaches of the week. I'm compiling, and I get a ton of help. There are a lot of people on LinkedIn or email or Facebook or even Twitter that send me a lot of these breaches, and I compile all of my notes. But what's interesting is that a lot of these are actually coming from breach disclosures, meaning the company says, oh yeah, we got data breach, and so we have to report to California or New Hampshire, whatever state they're in. And then by virtue of that, more information tends to come out later, which is why I tend to update. SolarWinds would be another good example of that. They initially came out with their disclosure to the SEC saying that it's possible that 18,000 companies that were clients of theirs were potentially affected by the SolarWinds breach. Sunburst, as it's known. That's what FireEye named it. They're the ones who discovered it. But we later found out that they have something like 33,000 SolarWinds clients. And so, that are using the Orion platform, which is a platform that got hit. And so oftentimes what ends up happening is that these companies will, for lack of a better term, they'll either obfuscate their numbers or they'll lie. Like Equifax is a perfect example of that. They got hit, I believe it was in 2017, and they came out and said, oh yes, it was like 20 million people, and then it was 50 million people, and 2 years later it was 300 million people, and on and on and on. Yahoo did the same thing. Oh yes, we had like 80 million, then it was 100 million, then it was 1 billion, then 1.5 billion, then 2 billion, then 3 billion. And then pretty much if Yahoo even looked at it or breathed on it, it was probably hacked, including the neighbor's dog. I mean, that is probably one of the most egregious things that we have. And so as we're looking through these things and I'm seeing, oh yes, 80 million records from, whoever got hit, I'm thinking to myself, it's probably 500 million. And that's one of those things that I see consistently over time as I track these. And I've been doing breaches of the week for at least a couple of years now. And I can go back and actually see that companies have slowly, oh yeah, by the way, we found more evidence. No, you didn't. Oops. But that's what happens. Like the bomb dropped with Equifax, everybody was mad at them. Oh my God, they should go out of business. They try to mitigate it by saying it's not as bad, it's a low number, and when it's died down, essentially what happens is they'll go, oh yeah, by the way, it was like 10 times worse, but nobody's paying attention at that point. Or you'll see a massive data breach, and I predict these. When Marriott got hit, what I said in my breaches of the week video was like, I guarantee you next week is going to be full of data breaches, and it exploded. Pizza Hut declared, like a whole bunch of others, and it's because everybody is looking at Marriott. And so Pizza Hut and all the others are like, oh, look at Marriott, we got breached. But look at Marriott's huge, And so they're using that as quite a bit when I'm small doctors' offices of the world. They're all best, most strategic time to actually release it when there's a massive this just horrific building collapse in Miami, right? Everybody's talking about that. It just happened in the last couple of, I think it was yesterday. I'm guarantee you there will probably be companies that will say now's the time to basically disclose our data breach, because everybody's looking at the building collapse in Miami. So it doesn't necessarily have to be data breaches, but I see that quite a bit. It's a very common thing.
With ransomware more and more in the headlines, have you heard any news around an uptick in cyber insurance as a byproduct of all of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, the cyber insurance companies at this point, I think, are working overtime. More people are definitely buying cyber insurance now than they've ever bought in the past because they're seeing everybody around them. Even if they haven't been hit, they probably had a competitor that's been hit, or they know somebody that's been hit in this way, shape, or form. And so cyber insurance has definitely grown. There's no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. The problem, though, that we have with cyber insurance, at least here in the United States, is that at the end of the Trump administration, the Federal Trade Commission came out and basically told the cyber insurance companies that it's against the law to pay out on a data breach if the attackers are suspected to be from an adversarial country. So if the attackers are based in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, etc., the cyber insurance company can say, well, we don't have to pay that because they're in Iran and here we are. And that has been very concerning because obviously there's a lot of state-sponsored groups that will run ransomware, or the Russian mafia, for example. There's a lot. I'm not singling out any one country here, but I think it's important to understand that. And we're hoping that under the Biden administration, we are actually going to see that reversed back, because while nobody wants to pay an adversarial country per se, these people are less appealing. It's less appealing to get cyber insurance if it's not going to cover where a healthy percentage of these attacks are coming from. And so I think that's a huge problem that we're going to see. Also, premiums are going up. We're starting to see a lot more supply chain awareness by virtue of that. And so the insurance companies are starting to get a little more aggressive in asking the questions. And when you fill out those forms and, if you're lying like, oh, yes, I have a firewall. Oh, yes, I have MFA. Oh, yes, I have encryption. Oh, yes. And you get a data breach and they bring in their investigative and you don't have any of those things that you just agreed to, they're not going to honor that. And so by virtue of that, actions are getting more stringent, and I think people are realizing, I really should lie on this, it's done because it's thing to do. And I can't tell you simply if the Microsoft Office 365 instance for the company had simply enabled the free MFA from Microsoft. Like, forget the identity management, which everybody needs. If you had just enabled the Microsoft Authenticate app, it would have thwarted multiple breaches that we've been involved in to remediate on new clients. It's a huge thing. It really is. So these are table stakes. The insurance companies know it, and by virtue of that, they want you to enforce it as well.
Another issue that I see is if cyber insurance becomes so affordable, there will be no incentive for companies not to pay the ransom. Because I was speaking with an insurance provider recently, and he mentioned it's about $1,500 a year per million for insurance. So, if Colonial paid $5 million, it cost them peanuts for insurance, and there's no incentive for them not to pay, and for others. So,
right. Well, and so in Colonial's case, their rates will go up. We also wonder if the government didn't subsidize that outside of their insurance just because it was so critical to the smooth operations of the country. But I recently, I do daily videos and podcasts, and I recently did one on this very subject because the Associated Press recently reported about a week ago, and I didn't even think about this, but they're 100% right, that your ransomware attack, like Colonial Pipeline, if they're paying $5 million, that's tax deductible for them with the IRS. And so by virtue of that, the FBI says, don't pay the ransom, don't pay the ransom. We don't want to, feed the beast. And the companies are like, well, but I'm going to get a tax deduction. Because if you think about it, non-technical things like ransom or thievery for the company are losses that a company can write off on their taxes. And somewhere it's the same thing, which is even more incentive for a company to basically pay the ransom off, even if they can restore the data. And usually, if they can restore the data, they're making then the calculation of the reputation damage that they are going to experience by virtue of having their customers' data out there, as they got hit. Who's going to want to work with you if you're the one that got them breached? Is kind of the lie. By virtue of that, it's a huge thing. But yeah, ransomware is tax deductible here in the United States, so that's great.
It's unbelievable. Nick, this has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate your insights. And if anybody would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Sure. I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn @/ Nick Espinosa. Feel free to connect to me. Twitter is Nick AESP. YouTube is / Nick Espinosa. I think Facebook's Nick AESP. So it's either going to be Nick AESP or just Nick Espinosa. Sometimes I didn't get a choice. But yeah, feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn and, send me a note.
Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today on Cybersecurity Heroes. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.